The press is still there. Not the building. The building came down sometime in the 1920s when the block was cleared and rebuilt in brick and glass and the kind of commercial optimism that prefers not to look too carefully at what it replaced. But the press itself, a Washington hand press manufactured in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the year 1861, is catalogued in the collection of a regional historical society in western Pennsylvania, its iron frame intact, its platen scarred, one of its feed guides bent at an angle that suggests force rather than accident. The object has no interpretive placard beyond its date of manufacture and the name of its last documented owner. The last documented owner is the reason this record exists at all. His name was Edmund Carver, and in the autumn of 1885 he was 53 years old and had been the editor and sole proprietor of a weekly newspaper called the Harwick Courier for 19 years. The Courier served a town of approximately 4,000 people in the western Pennsylvania hill country, a community built on lumber and light industry and the particular social confidence of a place that has been in the same location long enough to believe it always will be. Carver had printed that paper every Thursday without interruption since 1866. He had printed through 2 floods, through a fire that destroyed his compositing frames and required 3 weeks of rebuilding, through the death of his wife in 1879 and the departure of his 2 apprentices the following year for opportunities in Pittsburgh. He was, by any measure available to the historical record, a man of considerable stubbornness. In the first week of October 1885, he printed something that the record suggests he had been sitting on for a very long time. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. The edition in question was the issue of Thursday, the 8th of October, 1885. It does not survive in complete form. What survives is a partial copy, 3 of the 4 printed pages, held in a private collection in Ohio whose owner has permitted limited access to researchers. The surviving pages show a paper that was, in almost every respect, identical to the Harwick Courier of any other week. Local notices, a report on the condition of the bridge at Miller Creek, an account of a church social, a column on the price of timber in the regional market, and then running across the bottom of the front page and continuing in full across the entirety of page 2, a piece that Carver had titled, in the measured language he used for everything he considered serious, simply, "What the Survey Found." The survey in question had been conducted in the spring of 1884 by a team of 4 men working under the direction of a geologist named Harlan Foss, who was employed at that time by a land and mineral rights company operating out of Philadelphia. Foss and his team had spent 11 weeks in the western Pennsylvania hill country, moving through the forested ridgelines with instruments and notebooks documenting geological formations, water table depths, and subsurface mineral signatures across a corridor of land approximately 40 miles long and 12 miles wide. The corridor ran directly beneath and around the town of Harwick. Foss's findings had been submitted to his employer in the summer of 1884 and had not been made public. How Carver obtained a copy of the survey report is not established by any surviving document. What is established is that he had read it thoroughly, that he had spent over a year cross-referencing its findings against public land records, county maps, and the deeds held by residents of the surrounding townships, and that what he found in that cross-referencing process was something that the survey's commissioners had apparently not anticipated anyone outside their offices would ever examine in that kind of detail. The survey had identified, beneath the land on which Harwick and 6 surrounding communities sat, a coal seam of extraordinary depth and continuity, not an uncommon finding in western Pennsylvania in 1884. The region's coal geology was already well understood by that period, and extraction operations were expanding through the hill country with considerable speed. What made Foss's survey significant was not the seam itself, but the map that accompanied it. The map showed the subsurface boundary of the seam in relation to existing property lines, and the property lines on Foss's map were not the property lines that appeared in the county's public records. They were different, in some cases substantially different. The discrepancy was not the kind that results from imprecise surveying or clerical error. The differences were consistent and directional. In each case where a discrepancy appeared, the boundary shown on Foss's private map placed a larger portion of the subsurface mineral rights in the possession of a set of landholding entities that were not local landowners and not county or state institutions. They were holding companies, incorporated in Pennsylvania and Delaware, whose names appeared in no local directory, and whose officers were not identified in any public filing that Carver had been able to locate. What Carver had found, and what he printed across the front page and page 2 of the Harwick Courier on the 8th of October 1885, was evidence that the subsurface mineral rights beneath a significant portion of the western Pennsylvania hill country had been systematically mapped and, he argued, systematically acquired through a process that the public record of land transfers did not reflect, and that the residents living on the surface of that land had no knowledge of. He named the survey, he named Harlan Foss, he named the Philadelphia Company. He named 4 of the holding entities that appeared on the private map. He reproduced in as much detail as his press and his column width permitted the discrepancies between Foss's map and the county's official land records. He was careful, he was specific. He did not use language that went beyond what the documents showed. The Harwick Courier had a circulation of approximately 340 copies per week, distributed by wagon to subscribers within a 12-mile radius of the town, and available for purchase at the post office, the general store, and the office of the paper itself. The edition of October 8, 1885, was printed in its usual run of 360 copies, accounting for a modest oversupply. Carver ran the press himself, as he had done for years. He folded and stacked the copies on the evening of Wednesday the 7th, and left them bundled on the table beside his press, to be collected and distributed the following morning. On the morning of Thursday the 8th, the bundles were still there. The wagon that collected the courier for distribution each week did not arrive. The wagon's absence is documented not by Carver himself, but by a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who ran the post office counter in Harwick, and who kept a personal diary between the years 1882 and 1891. The diary is held by her granddaughter's family in Wheeling, West Virginia, and has been partially transcribed by a local genealogical society. The entry for Thursday, the 9th of October, 1885, Pruitt dated her entries the morning after, notes that the courier had not arrived, that 2 subscribers had come to the counter asking about it, and that when she sent her son to inquire at Carver's office on Merchant Street, the boy returned to report that the office was locked and no one had answered his knock. This is the last entry in Agnes Pruitt's diary that mentions Carver or the paper by name. The following week's entry records only that the courier had resumed and that the edition contained nothing of particular note. There is no entry describing what happened in the interval. What happened in the interval is where the record becomes sparse in the particular way that suggests the sparseness is not accidental. The edition of October 15, 1885, the week following the suppressed distribution, survives in 2 copies, one held by the Historical Society that also holds Carver's press, and one discovered in the 1890s tucked inside the back cover of a ledger at a farm auction outside the town. Both copies are identical and both are unremarkable. Local notices, a report on the timber market, a brief account of a town council meeting, no reference to the survey, no reference to the holding companies, no reference to the edition of October 8th at all. The October 8th edition itself, the one Carver printed and stacked and that was never distributed through normal channels, does not appear in any library collection, any archive, any institutional holding in Pennsylvania, or in any adjacent state whose records have been examined by researchers working in this area. 3 partial copies are known to exist. The Ohio copy, 3 pages of 4, a single page, the front page only, held by the family of a man named George Allen, who was a subscriber to the Courier and who appears in census records as a farmer living 7 miles outside Harwick, and a photographic reproduction of a portion of page 2, origin unknown, that appeared in a short-lived regional history newsletter in 1963 and has been reproduced in limited genealogical literature since. The photographic reproduction is significant because it captures the section of the article in which Carver names the 4 holding entities and describes the discrepancy in the subsurface boundary lines with the most precision. It is the clearest surviving evidence of what the article actually argued. Someone had that page photographed. Someone thought it worth preserving in that form. Who that was and when the photograph was taken relative to the events of October 1885 is not established. What is established is that Carver continued to operate the Courier without interruption following the October 8th edition. He printed the paper every Thursday for another 11 months. The issues from that period that survive are consistent with the unremarkable edition of October 15th. Local news, agricultural reports, accounts of community events. If you read them in sequence without knowing what preceded them, you would have no reason to suspect that anything had occurred. The press that sits in the Historical Society collection in western Pennsylvania was surrendered by Carver in September of 1886. The record of the transfer describes it as a sale and names a buyer whose subsequent history in the county records is brief. A single property tax entry in 1887 and then nothing. The Courier itself continued under new editorship for 3 more years before ceasing publication in 1889. The new editor's name was William Stabb. Nothing in the surviving issues of the Courier under Stabb's editorship indicates any awareness of or reference to what Carver had printed. Carver left Harwick in the autumn of 1886, shortly after the press transfer. He moved first to Pittsburgh, where he appears in a city directory in 1887 as a compositor employed by a commercial printing firm. By 1890, he is listed in the directory of a smaller city in Ohio. By 1895, he is not findable in any directory that has been searched. He died, according to a death record located in an Ohio county courthouse, in 1903. The record lists his occupation as printer. It lists no survivors. It lists no cause of death beyond the general notation used in that period for deaths attributed to age and chronic illness. He was 71 years old. He left no known estate inventory, no identified correspondence, and no further published work after September of 1886. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The Land and Mineral Rights Company, whose survey Carver had obtained and written about, continued to operate in western Pennsylvania through the 1890s. Under its original name, and under at least 2 successor names, it participated in the acquisition of subsurface mineral rights across a corridor of the hill country that expanded considerably beyond the 40-mile zone Foss had surveyed in 1884. The coal extraction operations that followed, beginning in the early 1890s and accelerating through the first decade of the 20th century, were among the more productive in the region. The communities above those operations experienced the changes that accompanied intensive underground extraction throughout that period: subsidence, water table disruption, the particular economic reorganization that occurs when the primary employer is an entity that holds its assets in a different state and answers to investors who have never seen the land in question. What those communities did not experience, because the mechanism for that experience had been removed, was a local press willing to print what the survey had shown before the operations began. The holding companies named in Carver's article are traceable through Pennsylvania corporate records of the period, though the records thinned considerably after the early 1890s when several of the entities were dissolved or merged into larger structures. The names of their principals do not appear in the surviving records with any consistency. The officers listed in the original incorporation documents are, in most cases, attorneys or agents rather than beneficial owners, which was a common practice of the period for entities whose principals preferred not to be publicly associated with their holdings. Harlan Foss, the geologist whose survey initiated the chain of events that led to Carver's article, continued to work as a consulting geologist in Pennsylvania and Ohio through the 1890s. He appears as a named expert in at least 3 legal proceedings related to mineral rights disputes during that period. He gave a paper at a professional society meeting in Pittsburgh in 1891 on the subject of coal seam mapping methodology. He does not appear to have ever commented publicly on the survey he conducted in 1884 or on its subsequent use. His professional papers, if they survive, have not been located. The county whose land records Carver had compared against Foss's private map undertook a comprehensive resurvey of subsurface mineral rights boundaries in 1888, 3 years after the suppressed edition, and 2 years after Carver sold his press and left the town. The resurvey was conducted by a different firm, its findings aligned in the areas where comparison is possible more closely with the boundaries shown on Foss's private map than with the boundaries that had previously appeared in the county's public records. The county adopted the new boundaries without recorded public debate. The minutes of the county commissioners for the period in which the resurvey was adopted run to 4 pages. The adoption itself occupies 3 lines. The press is the last object in this record that can be touched. It sits in a storage room behind the display floor of the Historical Society, catalogued under a reference number that connects it to no broader story, no account of what it last printed, or why its owner left the county the year after he sold it. The bent feed guide is visible if you know to look for it. The acquisition notes describe the press as coming from the estate of an unnamed intermediary buyer. The name Edmund Carver does not appear in the acquisition record at all. What the press printed on the evening of Wednesday, the 7th of October 1885, 360 copies of an article that named names, cited documents, and asked a county of 4,000 people to look carefully at who owned what beneath the ground they built on. Those copies went nowhere. Paper is fragile. Suppression does not require fire when indifference and time accomplish the same result. 3 partial copies remain. A bent piece of iron in a storage room. A death record in Ohio listing occupation as printer and survivors as none. A photographic reproduction of a portion of page 2, circulating in genealogical newsletters for 60 years, attributed to no one, sourced to nothing, preserved by whoever thought it worth the cost of a photograph, without leaving any record of why. The county commissioners adopted the new mineral boundaries in 3 lines of meeting minutes. The coal came out of the ground for 40 years after that. The communities above it are still there, smaller now, and the question of what they were told and what they were not told before the extraction began is not a question the official record is equipped to answer. It never was. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.